Hey everybody, it's low carb and keto nutritionist Amy Berger from 2itnutrition.com bringing you the next video in doing keto without the crazy. Today's topic is a big one, a very important one, type 1 diabetes. Of course, since we're talking about a medical condition, disclaimer right here up front, I'm not a medical doctor, I'm a nutritionist. None of this, none of anything in any of my videos is ever medical advice. I'm not treating, preventing, curing, or diagnosing any medical condition, right? Okay, now that the legalese is out of the way, before we get into matters, I have to say some thank yous to some fans. I have the greatest fans ever. I just came back a couple of days ago from Low Carb Houston. What a fabulous event that was. I'm not going to go into detail about it, but it was a really, really great conference. And muchas gracias a mis amigos William y Florecita para el regalo para el café. They brought me this little gift. It's, I didn't, unwrap it, so to speak, yet. It's this little, like, rubbery tomato top looking thing to put on my cup of coffee, because they saw me, I think, in a video with a little tea towel over it. I like to cover my coffee so it stays hot longer, all the steam and all the heat doesn't escape. And they got me this little thing. So muchas gracias, William. Mi Florecita. I'm so touched by that. And as long as I'm saying some fan thank yous, I was at an event in Indiana, Terre Haute, Indiana. Somebody brought me coffee, clearly big fans, clearly people who know I'm a total coffee junkie. I don't remember your name. I think it's Nancy. It might be Linda. I saw you in Indiana, and I just saw you again in Houston. And I even said, you're the one who brought me coffee, and I forgot your name. So if you are Nancy or Linda or whatever your name is, thank you. I'm using it. You can see it's already. I've used some. And let's see. Also in Houston, somebody, I don't remember her name again. I'm so sorry. We met at Keto Fest, and then we just saw each other again in Houston. You brought me this awesome homemade bacon soap. You all know you can make soap from fat, right? You can make it from tallow, you can make it lard, bacon fat. That's how they used to make soap. You mix it with like ash and lye, and it's this whole process, and you make soap, and it kind of smells a little bacon fatty, which is perfectly fine with me. Homemade soap from a fan. And last but certainly not least, I have spoken at events in Canada a few times now. I mentioned that I'm a big hockey fan, and I wouldn't mind if people want to bring me stuff from their favorite teams. So somebody brought me this awesome Vancouver Canucks t-shirt. Hello. So are fans obligated to bring me fun stuff every time they meet me? Absolutely not. But if you do, thank you so much. Wow. Okay, gotta move on. Gotta talk about type 1 diabetes. I've said the disclaimer. Now what else? Please know, I'm going to put a lot of links below in the notes for this video. Lots of links that you will definitely want to check out if you have type 1 diabetes, or someone you know, someone in your family or friend circle has type 1. There's going to be links to some of the books I'm going to mention, and links to websites or Twitter accounts of medical doctors or PhD researchers who either have type 1 diabetes themselves and are using low carb or ketogenic diets to manage it, or who just research it and are very supportive of low carb and ketogenic diets for people with type 1 diabetes. Okay, so I'm gonna start off with two books that I'm going to recommend highly. If you have type 1 diabetes, or someone you know has type 1 diabetes, you have likely already read these or know about them. If you haven't read them yet, get thee to Amazon or a library or a bookstore immediately and get these immediately post haste. Number 1, Dr. Bernstein's Diabetes Solution. They call this the Bible. This is the Diabetes Bible. It's good for type 2 as well, but if you have type 1, you really have to read this. It's not an easy read. You can see this is an encyclopedic tome. You read this book, it's not easy. I struggled to read this, to be honest. It's extremely detailed, but you read this book, you will know more than 98% of endocrinologists, including diabetes specialists and dietetic diabetes educators. Dr. Westman, I'm a big fan. He calls Dr. Bernstein the Oracle. If Dr. Westman calls somebody else the Oracle, they know what they're talking about. So Dr. Bernstein's Diabetes Solution. And the other book that I highly recommend is The Ketogenic Diet for Type 1 Diabetes by a personal friend and colleague, Miss Ellen Davis, who has a master's in nutrition, and Keith Runyon, MD. Dr. Runyon is based out of Florida. He's an MD who has type 1 diabetes, and guess what? Uses a ketogenic diet to manage it. So let's see, I'll have links to both of these books below as well. Now, let's talk about type 1, because I'm trying to have shorter videos, and this is probably not going to be one of them. I have no notes, so I just hope I don't forget anything critically important. The first thing to know is that type 1 diabetes is totally different from type 2 diabetes, right? In most cases, until the very end stage when the pancreas burns out, type 2 diabetics typically have very high insulin, right? In type 1 diabetes, they have very, very little to no insulin. And that's because type 1 diabetes comes from an autoimmune attack on the beta cells of the pancreas, which are the cells that secrete insulin. And it usually is diagnosed in childhood. They used to call this is what you've heard called juvenile diabetes, except it can occur later in life. People can get it in adulthood. And of course, now we know, unfortunately, little kids can also be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. So instead of calling those juvenile diabetes and adult onset diabetes like they used to, it's now just type 1 and type 2. So a type 1 diabetic, no matter how well controlled their diet or their blood sugar is, no matter how ketogenic they are, no matter how awesome they're following a low carb diet, a type 1 diabetic will always require some amount of exogenous insulin. Let's get that straight right here. They will always require some amount of injected insulin. Now, the beauty of doing a low carb diet, well, let's see. Let's take a step back before I get back to Dr. Bernstein, the Oracle. The reason ketogenic diets or low carb diets are typically not only frowned upon, but actively discouraged, actively warned against in type 1 diabetic circles, among their dietitians, among their endocrinologists, is because there is still to this day this inexplicable, just totally false equation of diabetic ketoacidosis with nutritional ketosis, or what Dr. Robert Atkins called benign dietary ketosis. The diabetic ketoacidosis and nutritional ketosis are totally different things. They are orders of magnitude different. So to confuse these just because they both have keto in the name does diabetics a huge disservice. And I'm actually going to quote from the book, I'm showing a lot of books today, The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Performance, which is by the other two oracles, Drs. Stephen Phinney and Jeff Volek. Right here, good old page 35, they're talking about the difference between ketoacidosis and ketosis just because they both have keto in the name. Suggesting these two states are similar is like equating a gentle rain with a flood because they both involve water, right? Water isn't a problem. Ask somebody who's just been through a drought, or ask those people in those horrible California fires that are going on now. Water would be the greatest thing ever. Now talk to someone whose house has been just destroyed by a flood. Water's the worst thing ever. Water is not good or bad. Too much or too little is too good. Just like insulin, just like ketones, right? As much as we all love ketones, you don't want too much. But here's the thing. In a person with a healthy functioning pancreas, not a type 1 diabetic, ketone levels will never, ever get to diabetic ketoacidosis levels because ketones keep their own production in check. And there's the human body is very ingenious. It's got all kinds of feedback loops and control mechanisms to make sure that nothing dangerous ever gets out of control. So one of the ways that ketone production is kept in check is as your ketone level starts to rise, it actually becomes insulinogenic, meaning as your ketone level starts to creep up and up and up, it signals to the pancreas, hey pancreas, we have lots of ketones. We don't need any more fuel. Let's shut off that ketogenesis. Let's tell the liver to stop making ketones. So it does. Ketones keep their own production in check. Now, they don't spike insulin. It's just a very, very beautiful, delicate seesaw that keeps things kind of at an even keel. In type 1 diabetes, because they do not produce insulin, they either produce none or they produce very little. Remember, this is a destruction of the pancreatic beta cell. They don't have the insulin to keep that ketone production in check. So their ketones rise and rise and rise and keep rising. And ketone bodies are acidic. So when they accumulate massively high in the bloodstream, you can have ketoacidosis, which is a life-threatening, potentially fatal issue. This does not happen in people with healthy pancreases. It can happen rarely in somebody with type 2 diabetes if they're sick or they're on insulin or they're taking a drug called an SGLT2 inhibitor. I can't get into detail. Just know this isn't a problem exclusive to people with type 1 diabetes, but that's who is affected most often by ketoacidosis. Now, but again, we can't confuse nutritional, safe, controlled, benign nutritional dietary ketosis with wild, out of control ketoacidosis, right? To you and me, a ketone level in the blood, let's say beta hydroxybutyrate of 4, 5, 6, is pretty high. Even you might see 7 if you're doing an extended fast, 7 or 8 even. Once your ketone level's that high, you need to kind of keep an eye on things. But ketoacidosis is like 10, 15, 20, 25 millimolar in the blood. You will never see that in a well-controlled ketogenic diet in a healthy person with a healthy functioning pancreas and even, an appropriate amount of insulin. So anyway, that's where the confusion and the fear, the terrible fear of a ketogenic diet in the type 1 community comes, but it's totally different. Now, what else can I say? I want to make sure I don't really forget anything. I guess the bottom line is there are tons and tons and tons of people with type 1 diabetes managing diabetes beautifully with a low-carb or ketogenic diet. Now, Dr. Bernstein, the Oracle, calls it the law of small numbers. And what this means is if you have type 1 diabetes and you're eating a high carbohydrate diet, because your pancreas doesn't secrete insulin, you have to provide insulin through injections. And when you eat a lot of carbohydrate, you need a lot of insulin, right? And type 1 diabetics do not only have to match their insulin injection to the amount of carbohydrate in their diet, they have to bolus and dose insulin for the protein. So all the people, like, I can't get into the protein issue right now, but protein, some amino acids do get converted into glucose. Don't be afraid of that. Even if you have type 1 diabetes, that's not something to fear. It's something to understand and take advantage of if you don't have type 1 diabetes, and something to understand and manage appropriately if you do have type 1. Bottom line, type 1s have to bolus for the carbohydrate and protein that they eat. The more carbohydrate you eat, the more insulin you need. And the higher the numbers you're dealing with, the more volatile your blood glucose is going to be, right? When you use what we would call an industrial dose of insulin, a super high mega dose of insulin to cover the carbohydrate and the protein you're eating, you are more likely to have wild lows and highs in blood sugar, right? Because you take this very, very high dose of insulin, and just like somebody who's hyperinsulinemic who doesn't have type 1 diabetes, that insulin can overcorrect and take too much glucose out of the blood. Now you are hypoglycemic. That's what hypoglycemia is in somebody without type 1. They eat carbs, especially refined carbs, massive spike in insulin, it overshoots, the glucose comes too low, and they have hypoglycemia. The solution to that isn't to eat sugar every 3 hours or 2 hours to keep your blood sugar up. The answer is to stop eating sugar in the first place. Stop eating the thing that makes the insulin skyrocket. That is a diversion. That's I digress. Let's get back to type 1. Again, the more insulin you need, the more volatile your blood glucose is going to be, the more unstable. And we see this in type 1 diabetics who use continuous glucose monitors. It's all over the map. It's up, it's down, including in dangerous areas. We're talking blood glucose of 30s, of 40s. We're talking blood glucose of 300, 400 in a single day. In a single day. It's like living in the desert where the daytime temperature could be 112 and the nighttime temperature is 20 degrees, Fahrenheit. Massive, massive swings. When a type 1 diabetic eats a very low carbohydrate diet, they have to dose very, very little for the carbohydrate because they're hardly eating any. And you have to dose very, very little for the protein because even though some amino acids convert to glucose, it's actually a very gradual, sort of gentle process that happens in the body. It's not this huge, massive dump of glucose into the blood like it is if you eat a donut or if you eat, a latte that has 40 grams of sugar. My camera's getting a little blurry. Sorry about that. So the less carbohydrate you eat and you sort of control for your protein with your insulin, the less insulin you need to use. And the less insulin you use, the less volatility you're going to have in the blood sugar. That's why I said Dr. Bernstein calls it the law of small numbers. Keep things low and manageable, and you're not going to have these super duper highs and lows. The CGM, the continuous glucose monitor patterns of type 1 diabetics that eat low carb or keto, they're not a flat line. They do still bump up and down a little, but that's okay. That's normal. It fluctuates within a healthy range. It fluctuates maybe, between 70s, 80s, and 120s or so, a very sort of normal, gradual up and down where you don't have these dips in cognition, these dips in energy, passing out, potentially very dangerous situations. And, what else can I say? That's really the main point. And it is so, so, so very critically important to control your blood sugar when you have type 1 diabetes. For all the same reasons it's important for all of us, healthy or type 2 diabetic or not, to control our blood sugar. Because long-term consequences of chronic hyperglycemia, chronically high blood sugar, are disastrous for the entire body. There is not one single organ or tissue or gland or system that is not negatively affected by long-term chronically high blood sugar, right? The eyes, the kidneys, the liver, the pancreas, the skin, the blood vessels, the ovaries, the brain, right? I did a post on PCOS. I've done posts on well, I haven't really done posts on kidney function yet, but we know diabetic nephropathy, the damage to the teeny tiny blood vessels in the kidneys, the eyes, diabetic retinopathy. It's terribly high blood sugar does a real number, gives a real beating to the microscopic tiny blood vessels in some of these organs and tissues. The brain, I wrote a whole book on Alzheimer's disease, which they call type 3 diabetes, right? Because of glucose problems in the brain. I just did a post on insulin and the skin. Now that's insulin, but chronically high blood glucose can age the skin also. And we're not, we're not just we are literally talking about blindness. We're talking about losing limbs. We're talking about amputation of the feet, of the legs. We're talking about, heart attacks, strokes. So you don't want chronically high blood sugar. But if you have type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes, or you're a healthy non-diabetic person, you also don't want very high levels of insulin, right? I talk about this all the time. I write about it all the time. Even people with normal blood sugar, but who have very high insulin, have, increased risk, or it's a actual causal factor for the PCOS, potentially Alzheimer's disease, erectile dysfunction, enlarged prostate gland, obesity, hypertension, skin tags, the list goes on and on. So if you have type 1 diabetes, you always need the insulin. Now, type 1 diabetics need what they call basal insulin, which is just a small amount of insulin that they would inject, I guess, typically in the morning. That's kind of a long acting, supposed to go either all day or many, many hours. Some of them will take more later in the day. The basal insulin is supposed to substitute for the basal level of insulin that a healthy non-type 1 diabetic pancreas would secrete. And I know I just said, oh, insulin is so bad. No. Insulin is an absolutely necessary essential hormone for healthy life. What we don't want is chronically high insulin, just like glucose. We need a little bit of glucose in the blood. We don't need it all the time, just like cortisol, just like any other hormone. All this stuff is necessary. What we don't want is super high levels of it around all the time. So a healthy pancreas secretes a little tiny trickle of insulin all the time. Why? partly to keep your own ketogenesis in check, partially to keep all kinds of stuff happening the way it's supposed to. Again, we don't hate insulin, we don't fear insulin, we want a healthy, lowish level of insulin. So that's what the basal level is for. And then the type 1 diabetics bolus, meaning they take a larger dose with each meal to account for the carbohydrate and protein in the meal. So a type 1 diabetic is typically dosing insulin, at least 4 times a day, that the basal amount, and then 3 times a day, or if they're only eating once or twice a day, maybe only once or twice. But in a type 1 diabetic, you don't want to use these industrial supraphysiologic doses of insulin, because there is actually something called double diabetes. And I'll maybe, again, put some links, lots and lots of links today in the notes here, to some scientific papers about this double diabetes. And what double diabetes is people with type 1 diabetes who have used such high doses of insulin for so long that they're now insulin resistant to the exogenous insulin. So they need more and more and more and more, just like a type 2 diabetic, or just like a non-diabetic person who is hyperinsulinemic all the time. They become they don't even produce insulin, and now they're insulin resistant because they were using such high amounts. This is a terrible place to be. So the best thing you can do is not use a whole lot of insulin. And the way to not use a whole lot of insulin is to not eat a whole lot of carbs. And, there really aren't a whole lot of studies on long-term use of ketogenic or low-carb diets in people with type 1 diabetes. But we know for absolute certain that long-term, poorly controlled type 1 diabetes, the people who are all over the map with blood sugar, they live much, much, much shorter lives. Their lifespan is significantly shorter than non-diabetics. And they have, of course, massively increased incidence of blindness, of kidney disease, of amputation, of all the terrible things that come from poorly managed, long-term high blood sugar. I just saw Dr. Jake Kushner, a PhD, give a talk on this at Low Carb Houston. I'll link to some of his other stuff here. He's got a great Twitter account. He's constantly sharing papers about this. It's just kind of a nightmare to be on a high-carb diet if you have type 1 diabetes. And what else can I say? I covered the double diabetes. So we would assume, we don't know for sure because the long-term studies haven't been done yet, but we would assume that the better controlled your blood glucose is with lower doses of insulin, the fewer complications you will have long-term, right? The more you will potentially prevent or reduce risk for some of those things. And there's, I'm a little bit all over the map with what I'm talking about. That's what happens when I don't have notes. But let's talk about what they call the honeymoon period. If you have type 1 diabetes, or you know someone who does, you might have heard this phrase, honeymoon period. And that is where, when you're first diagnosed, there might be this kind of honeymoon period or grace period where your beta cells are still producing some amount of insulin. And the longer you can keep that going, the longer you can postpone your need for exogenous insulin for those injections, again, the potentially better the outcome might be long term. Because once you start that insulin, it gets a little bit gnarly. And the way to prolong that honeymoon period might be to dramatically restrict your carbohydrate intake, because again, the less carbohydrate you're using, the less insulin your remaining intact beta cells will need to produce. And it may be that by not overworking them, they can survive a little bit longer. And that's speculation. We don't know. This honeymoon period does seem to exist, and it does seem to be able to be extended. It doesn't last forever. At some point, the honeymoon period will end, and you will absolutely need that exogenous insulin. But again, the longer you can maybe delay or postpone that from happening, the potentially better. See, I'm so careful with the language, potentially, maybe, What else? Covered honeymoon period, covered the double diabetes, which is so terrible, covered the books. So yeah, if you're living with this and you want to know more about this, There's a Facebook group called Type 1 Grit. Type 1 Grit, G-R-I-T, like they're gritty because they're using low-carb diets for their type 1. That is a group that adheres to Dr. Bernstein's protocol. Very, very strict. If I remember correctly, it's 12 grams of carbohydrate per meal for breakfast and lunch, and dinner might be 15 grams, maybe 20. The point is, the whole day is very, very low carb. And I would like to point out that Dr. Bernstein does not subscribe to protein restriction, not even in a type 1 diabetic, even though some amino acids from protein obviously do affect blood sugar. That is not a reason to restrict protein. Restricting protein is not a great idea, especially in growing children who are the ones most likely to be diagnosed with type 1. But really, at any stage of the life cycle, I don't think restricting protein is a good idea. Bernstein doesn't think restricting protein is a good idea. He really, I've seen him online, and I've seen him kind of address this in YouTube videos of his own, that he does not understand this newfangled version of low-carb keto where people are limiting protein and instead they're chugging fat. They're chugging oil, they're chugging lots of butter in their coffee, they're drowning everything in fat because they're afraid to eat a big honking piece of meat. This is entirely new and entirely unnecessary, even for someone with type 1 diabetes. You don't have to restrict protein, you just have to understand how to bolus your insulin for it. And I guess that brings me to the next point. So no, let's step back. Type 1 Grit. They're on Facebook, you can find them. There's, I think, a public group and there's a closed private group. I think the private group is closed because you have to be adhering to this protocol, and I'm not sure how they verify that, but that's, you know, a requirement for membership in that group. These people have the most enviable blood glucose control you've ever seen. They not only control they're not only well controlled for type 1 diabetics, they're well controlled, period. They have hemoglobin A1Cs in the 4s, 4.7, 4.9, maybe 5.2, 5.0. We're talking better than like the vast majority of millions of people who don't have any kind of diabetes, let alone type 1, right? So they're controlled beautifully because they have to. They understand the radical seriousness of the condition they're living with. They don't have the wiggle room to play around. You know I'm always like, oh, you know, every now and then I have some bread, every now and then I have the donut, like once in a while. I don't have diabetes. I don't have type 1 diabetes. You know, I'm not afraid of what's going to happen. And the fact is, I've gained some weight, and I'm going to get a little bit stricter and see how much I can accomplish in terms of some body fat loss by the end of the year. But what I'm saying is, if I was living with type 1 diabetes, I probably wouldn't mess around with the I'll just have the one candy this time. Oh, I'll just do it this time. I probably would really, you know, do my best to live within what was the safest for me on my blood sugar. But there was actually a study, a peer-reviewed scientific, well, it wasn't really a study, it was a survey of the Type 1 Grit Facebook group that got published in the journal Pediatrics. I'll put a link to it. It was Dr. Westman was an author on that. Dr. Bernstein was an author on that. Dr. David Ludwig from Harvard was an author on it. Kara Ebeling. I'm trying to think. Will Yancey, who is I don't know if he's at Duke University. Yes, he's at Duke. He's at the Durham VA Medical Center. He also keto, low carb friendly MD. He is on the American Diabetes Association panel that just came out earlier this year, 2019, with their consensus statement saying that very low carb diets had the most evidence for improving blood sugar in diabetes. Not just a little evidence, the most evidence. An American Diabetes Association panel. So thanks, Dr. Yancey, for that. Lots of other authors on that paper, but they did a survey so it's not like a randomized clinical trial, but they did a survey of the members of Type 1 Grit. You know, how is your blood sugar managed? How's your A1C? What are the complications you're facing? Have you know, how many events of hypoglycemia or even, you know, ketoacidosis? How much of this have you had since going keto? And results were, not surprisingly, beautiful. These people are really, really well controlled. A few of them did have some occurrences of hypoglycemia, some occurrences of ketoacidosis, because guess what? It happens, even on a low carb diet. Can you imagine how difficult it is to mimic what your pancreas does naturally 24/7 in response to ever-changing by the second fluctuations in blood glucose, glucagon, insulin, all this stuff that your pancreas does with no conscious input or effort from you? It's really, really hard to mimic that perfectly with injecting insulin. Even if you're on a pump, there's these pumps where the insulin just kind of automatically dispenses based on constant readings of your blood sugar. Even then, it's really, really hard to do this dance on your own from the outside. So, it's no surprise that blood sugar isn't perfect all the time in these people. The fact that it's so good most of the time is what is amazing about low carb and keto for type 1 diabetes. And they even surveyed, if you're not doing keto, what stopped you? Or, if you are doing keto, how does your medical team feel? How do your doctors feel? How does your endocrinologist feel about you doing this? And, really sadly, some of the people were either talked out of it by their endocrinologist or by a dietitian or nutritionist, or they're doing it anyway against the advice, against the wishes of their medical and dietetics team. Again, because of this unfounded, out-of-date, misguided fear, confusing ketosis with diabetic ketoacidosis. They ain't the same thing. And so it's really unfortunate when you have a medical and dietetics nutrition team that doesn't understand what you can do for yourself if you have type 1 diabetes. But that study was amazing, really, just super, super amazing control of blood sugar. Again, better than you see in people that don't have diabetes. So what else can I say? Obviously, I had my disclaimer at the beginning. I'm not a doctor. I don't specialize in keto for type 1 diabetes. I am not educated enough in the real nitty-gritty details to help somebody. So when I get an inquiry from somebody, hey, I have type 1 diabetes, looking for help with keto, I refer to colleagues of mine that do specialize in type 1. And I'll put links to their stuff. One of them is Joy Kitty, Kiddie. She's a registered dietitian. Yes, there are actual RDs who are keto friendly. She's lost I think 40 pounds, maybe more. She's lost a whole bunch of weight herself on keto. She had type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes, if I recall correctly. She doesn't have type 1, but anyway, she is an RD. And let's see, she's in Canada. I think she's in the Vancouver area. And then there is my colleague and actually dear personal friend, Francisca Spritzer, RD, again, registered dietitian. She's also a CD, certified diabetes educator. She's the author of the Low Carb Dietitian's Guide to Health and Beauty. This obviously is not a book about type 1 diabetes. It's about using low carb for the skin, for the eyes, for all the other great things it does to the body. If you want to know why a keto diet could be good for your skin, read my blog post, go to 2atnutrition.com, or I did a video on the skin as well. Anyway, Francisca Spritzer, she writes for dietdoctor.com, the world's most popular, most highly trafficked low carb website, but she does see clients still. And she has to see clients to stay current in her certifications. And she has a good deal of experience with type 1 diabetes. She can sort of help you manage all those ins and outs. And let's see what else I need to say. So yeah, if you have type 1 diabetes, don't do this on your own. Do not repeat, do not do this on your own. Be supervised by a doctor, be supervised by a dietitian, have an endocrinologist, monitoring you. You want to make sure that you're doing well. You can monitor yourself, get a CGM. I see these biohackers, which another phrase that's like nails on a chalkboard to me, like the biohacking. The people that want to track and measure their data and have all these wearables all day long seem to be the people who need it the least. You have extremely healthy, fit people with CGMs, with sleep rings, with all kinds of stuff on them. How many steps did I take? What's my heart rate variability? If there was ever a case to use a CGM, it's in someone who has type 1 diabetes, because you can probably within days identify what foods are good for your blood sugar and what foods are not so great for your blood sugar. Now, you will always need the insulin, but you will, let's follow the prescribed diet that somebody gave me, or even my doctor gave me. I'm having tons and tons of carbs. I'm having my orange juice and my whole wheat cereal and skim milk for breakfast, and whoa, there's my blood sugar. Versus I'm having my eggs and my bacon, and here's my blood sugar. So, you can see very easily for yourself with the CGM. So if there was ever somebody that is probably the best candidate to use a CGM, it's not a healthy, fit person, it's not an athlete, it is somebody with type 1 diabetes. And I'm not opposed to those other people using this technology. I just think the person that can probably benefit from it the most, the person whose life would be changed for the better the most, is somebody with type 1 diabetes. But do always work with a doctor and or a nutritionist who's savvy in all this stuff. And what else can I say? Reminder of the books, Dr. Bernstein's Diabetes Solution, and my colleague and friend Ellen and Dr. Runyon's book, The Ketogenic Diet for Type 1 Diabetes. I think that's all I really needed to say. Again, as a review, this is totally different from type 2 diabetes. Insulin is not the enemy. Insulin is actually life-saving medical therapy for people with type 1 diabetes. But again, the lower the amount of insulin you can use, the less volatility, the less very highs and very lows you will experience. That law of small numbers. And again, lots of links. I'm going to have links to papers, links to the books, links to the Twitter accounts of the doctors and dietitians and researchers that are doing keto for type 1. And what else can I say? I don't know. I guess that's it. My website is 2atnutrition.com, and if you like these videos, if you want to help me keep making them, you can support me on Patreon, patreon.com/2atnutrition. You can support me for as little as $2 a month, the price of a cup of coffee, $2 a month, or there's a $3 a month level. At $5 a month, if you can spare $5 a month, you will get early access to blog posts. You will get to read new blog posts about a week before the rest of the world. And $10 a month is another level of support that you get, another perk. You can go to patreon.com/2atnutrition and see what those are. If you're not into PayPal, I know some people aren't, and you want to throw some support my way to help keep me making these videos and blog posts, you can go to paypal.com and send me any contribution you wish to my email address, 2atnutrition@gmail.com. I have a long list now of viewer requests to get to for topics. If you have a topic you want me to get to, though, send me an email, 2atnutrition@gmail.com. I can't guarantee I'll see it in the comments, so don't leave it in the comments. Send me an email if you have an idea. Upcoming topics that I'm going to do that are my own ideas and viewer requests: how to stay keto or low carb in the military. You all know I'm an Air Force veteran, so we'll do keto in the military. Somebody requested a video on heart failure. Somebody requested one on like ADD, ADHD. What else am I doing? My list is over there. I don't want to get up and get it. Oh, plant toxins. So I'm not really going to do carnivore diet, but I'll talk about plant toxins. That's another viewer request. And there's some more. I don't remember what they are. If you sent me an idea, don't worry. I have it on the list. And that's it. Thank you for watching. I will see you next time. Take care. Bye.